Hello everyone, Arun Vanagopal of WNYC here. It's my pleasure to introduce the Center for Traditional Music and Dances series, Beat of the Boroughs, NYC Online. This online series features over 50 of New York's leading traditional instrumentalists, dancers, singers, poets, and more. From Mongolia to Haiti, Colombia to the Gambia, among many others, they remind us how the strength of our country lies in its embrace of diversity and immigration. We want to celebrate these remarkable members of the New York community in these challenging times. So please enjoy these 50 programs, share them with your friends, and spread the word. Enjoy the show.
Okay, Pete, do you want to say something or should I just start? Yeah.
Go ahead, Mark. I just wanted to say, though, that we're doing this as in partnership with Center for Traditional Music and Dance's Beat of the Boroughs online video series. We're doing a whole bunch of videos of wonderful artists and thinkers about traditional musics and performing arts around the five boroughs of New York City. And we're making an exception to allow Dr. Henkes Netsky to be one of our special guests today, because we know he's not quite in that geography, but he's a dear friend and a wonderful scholar of Yiddish traditions anyway. So, but it's all on you, Mark Slobin. Thanks so much.
Well, first of all, I have to thank Pete and the CTMD for hosting the kind of brainstorm to have Inside the Yiddish Folksong, and we have to thank Clara for her amazing work in creating the website and curating it in last minute details and hosting the session today. So without which we couldn't do this. And I'll mention that CTMD, of course, sponsors Yiddish New York, and we will follow up on this project. The next thing in about 6 months will be around this project will be at Yiddish New York. And I'll explain later what our next initiative will be. But basically I want to thank all of you without whom we wouldn't have started this. The enthusiasm for the idea of the Yiddish folk song has been taken some of us aback and some of us by surprise, and are delighted from the point of view of the Jungwag, these young people who are just decided this is something to really invest their time and talent in, which we had not expected in a way, and the veterans, people who've been around the song for a long time, who have been kind of part of a resurgence. So we were inspired to create the site. The site is there, and it's just been expanded with the contributions of the three people who are going to speak to us today. So I'll let them talk about each one, what they're doing in their contributions. And I'll just say that this is an ongoing project. The idea is that this will be the go-to site for understanding the Yiddish folk song, not just for listening to it. This remains the only major European folk song tradition with no literature of analysis and study, although there are a lot of collections. So we're filling that, trying to begin to fill a huge gap left by 100 years of kind of neglect of that side of the Yiddish folk song. So our first up will be, everything's alphabetical, and I also have to acknowledge our team, the rest of, on whose behalf I'm speaking, Michael Alpert, Zev Feldman, Ethel Rehm, Itzik Gottesman, and Josh Waletsky, some of whom could not be here today. But that's the brain trust that has been organizing this. So let me turn it over to Blindel, who I think really needs no introduction at all.
Well, thank you very much, Mark, and thank you, Pete, and of course, Clara. I'm really delighted with this initiative, and I know that this has been a topic that's interested Mark for a very long time, because we actually met probably around 1972, just when the YIVO Yiddish Folk Song Project was starting. So what I thought I would do today is really give you a kind of personal journey of how I came to the Yiddish Folk Song and to the YIVO Yiddish Folk Song Project, which is now, the recordings are now at YIVO and will hopefully be entirely available, digitized online with the entire apparatus. And I want to say something about what that project was and what it represented. But first, I want to acknowledge the people that were really part of this project. And we're going back now more than 50 years, actually 50 years, almost exactly. And of course, Mark Slobin, the late Chaim Lotek, who was really the doyen of the Yiddish folk song, Josh Waletsky and Razel Kalafovich, Toby Dobkin, Bob Rothstein helped us as well. I know he's here with us today. Ethel Rehm and Marty Koenig, who were the first to really present traditional Yiddish singers to the public. Itzik Gottesman and many, many others. So I would say that the 50-year lead up to this extraordinary project, which Mark, I think, has very accurately described, it's a 50-year lead up with some of the same players that were there from the very, very beginning, and of course, many, many new ones. So in terms of my personal journey, it really begins in 1967 when I was in the PhD program in folklore at Indiana University and was taking a field methods course with Jerome Mintz, and he encouraged me to do something on Yiddish folklore. And so in that context, I contacted the Center for Folklife Research. I'm not sure how exactly it was called, at what was then the Canadian Museum of Civilization in Ottawa, and they were doing surveys of immigrant communities in Canada, and they had done on Ukrainians and various and sundry. So I said, would you like to have a survey on Yiddish folklore in Toronto? And they said, sure. And so I began to record everything. I recorded proverbs and stories and riddles and folk remedies and folk toys and everything imaginable. And of course, it included folk songs. But there was a kind of, I would say, illuminating moment that really, it was a transformative moment. And what it was my mother's older sister had convened a bunch of us for dinner at her place. And it was my mother, myself, other family members, and Mariam Nierenberg, who was a cousin to my mother. And it was just like normal getting together. But my mother's sister, Sylvia, after we had the meal, we're sitting around the table and she looks at Mariam and she says, "Zing, sing." Mariam starts to sing. So Clara, I'd like you to play Schwarze Karschlach.
What happened?
Schwarzinke Karschalach reißt men, in Reutinke lässt men stehen, neu schöne Mäderlach nimmt men, in Missele hast men gehen, neu, wer ist sie mir, wer ist sie meine Juren, ich hab a Liebe geführt, schon 3 Vierteljahren, was teig mir die Polke Kaketke, als tanzen kenn ihr sie nicht, was teig mir die schöne Brunetke, als nemmen kenn ihr sie nicht, oi, wer ist sie mir, wer ist sie meine Juren, ich hab a Liebe geführt, schon 3 Vierteljahren. Was teig mir die schöne Kosatzke, als tanzen kenn ihr sie nicht. Was teig mir die Mädel, die Chwatzke, als nemmen kenn ihr sie nicht. Oi, wer ist sie mir, wer ist sie meine Juren, ich hab a Liebe geführt, schon 3 Vierteljahren. Was teig mir meine Teuf, mein Kopf, in meine gepiezte Schiech, als keiner will mich nicht nehmen, nehmen so mir nur der Riech, oi, wer ist sie mir, wer ist sie meine Juren, ich hab a Liebe geführt, schon 3 Vierteljahren.
Well, My jaw dropped. I was simply blown away. I sat there and I said, what? Mariam? I've known her all my life. A singer? What else does she know? So I then, I just, in my own family, I just simply couldn't believe it. And she is exquisite. The woman is exquisite. Could there be anything more delicious, more musical, more beautiful? I then proceeded, of course, to record everything that she sang. And she was incidentally an extremely difficult person to record. I mean, basically because she had a kind of sadistic streak, and I was her perfect victim. So it was not easy, let me tell you. But it was a revelation to me. And okay, so she's from a very, very small town near Brest-Litovsk, near what is Brest in Belarus today. At the time, it was in Poland. So it's Polesia, and so it's basically White Russia, Belarus. And so that was a kind of epiphany. And of course, that went into the Yiddish folklore survey. But then the second very important moment was when I started to come to New York in the summers to the Uriel Weinreich Yiddish summer program. And Mordechai Schechter encouraged me to record his mother's songs. And so in the summers, I actually recorded as much, I thought it was her whole repertoire. It was hard to know because she knew hundreds of songs, but I recorded hundreds of her songs. And of course, Itzik Gottesman has been recording her, and others have been recording her as well. So those were encounters with traditional singers, and that was in the late 60s. So this is, if you think 50 years later, you don't have that opportunity, that kind of opportunity, if it exists at all, would be very, 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 very rare. So to go very quickly to the Yiddish Yiddish Folksong project, and then I hope we'll have time during the questions and answers to be able to explore it a little bit more fully. It seemed to me my own work, based on that survey, was to go in the direction of narrative. So I actually wrote my doctoral dissertation on traditional storytelling in the Toronto Jewish community. But then after I had defended my dissertation, and not even after, but while I was writing my dissertation, I had the idea to create a Yiddish folksong project, and that it would differ from anything that had ever been done of the Yiddish folksong before. And it would differ for one extremely important reason. And I think this is really the gift of that project. And that is that it would take as its starting point the singer, not the song. That is what was revolutionary about this project. By taking the singer as the starting point, it meant that one would, first of all, record everything that singer sang. You wouldn't worry about, is it a folk song? Is it a song of literary origin? Is it Jewish? Is it not Jewish? Is it popular? Is it theater? That would be absolutely irrelevant. And what mattered would be to get at the total repertoire, to understand the musical culture of the singer and of the milieu in which the singer lived, and to interview the singers with a kind of depth that had never been done before. And of course, to record them singing, which meant that you got not only the words, but you got the melody, but you also got performance. And the in-depth interviewing went beyond creating what was called context. Where did you learn it? Where have you sung it? All that kind of thing. Where were you born? All of that, okay. But this went much further. It went to, what does the song mean to you? I was fascinated that Leuchtter sometimes left off the last verse because it was so painful. I don't know, the woman in the song, she committed suicide or something terrible happened, because a lot of these were really sad songs sung by women, love songs, songs of abandoned wives, songs of women who got pregnant and the father of the child disappeared. So it was to really try to get at what the songs meant to the singers, and to somehow get inside not only the song and the singer, but the musical culture, which this was part. So that was really the intention and the aim. And in the process, I had the good fortune that the Max Weinreich Center was up and running, the Max Weinreich Center for Advanced Jewish Studies. That meant that we could operate these inter-university graduate seminars, and I was able to run seminars specifically for the project and recruit all the students, each of whom found their own singer, or we identified a singer for them. And they then proceeded to do these really, really in-depth, comprehensive studies of an individual singer and their entire repertoire. And that is essentially the basis for the Yiddish Folksong project. So I think I'll leave it there, and hopefully there'll be an opportunity in the question and answer period to explore further.
Let me just ask you, Barbara, the current thing that we're putting up, we've put up a few things from the project. The current thing we're putting up now, which should be up maybe today, is a talk that you gave in Montreal at the very beginning of this journey, which has been translated into English by Josh Woletsky, and the recording of it. That's going up on Inside the Yiddish Folksong. Could you take a minute to explain what that
yes,
lecture was?
So this is actually also very, very, very important. And that is that when I took the fieldwork class at Indiana, and Jerry Mintz said, "Oh, you know Yiddish, do something." The first thing I did, literally, was I phoned New York. I phoned Michael Herzog in New York. Michael Herzog had taken over after Uriel Weinreich died, had taken over the Language and Culture Atlas of Ashkenazic Jewry. And I had known Michael since childhood because I had been a camper at Camp Kvutza, where he was the director. And at the time, he was writing his dissertation on Yiddish dialects of northeastern Poland, which is actually my mother's region, and also Mariam's. Anyway, the minute that Michael heard that I was going to work on that I was going to do something on Yiddish, and I told him about the Canadian Museum of Civilization that they'd contracted me to do the survey in Toronto, he said, "I'm sending you a ticket to New York. In 2 weeks, I expect you to be here." So I flew to New York, and I had no idea, what was in store for me. And he brought me to YIVO, and he introduced me to Bina Weinreich and Hanam Lotek and Dina Abramovich, and to all of the key people. He took me into the archive. He showed me the vault with the Shalom Aleichem recordings and the manuscripts, etc. And what emerged was that the Holocaust had created this chasm between a generation of folklorists working in Eastern Europe and who had perished on the Holocaust, and the YIVO was transplanted, but there was a huge gap in generations between that generation, a few people like Bina and Hanam Lotek who were working in the United States, but no younger generation with a PhD from an American university, academically trained in folklore. And so what I didn't really realize at the time, but only realized later, was that they saw in this young person, I was in my 20s, they sort of saw hope. They saw that this is hope. So they would trotted me out like at a dog show. It was, YIVO had an annual banquet. They did it at the Waldorf Astoria by gedeckte Tischen. That meant tables with tablecloths. And my parents flew in from Toronto for this event. So at their annual gala, in this case, first of all in New York and then in Montreal, I had to get up, and I had to give a formal academic lecture to these native speakers, not only native speakers of Yiddish, my parents are native speakers of Yiddish too. They said I sounded like a radio announcer, but to native speakers of Yiddish who spoke like the most perfect, most beautiful Yiddish imaginable, I had to get up and make an academic speech for half an hour in Yiddish about the Yiddish Folksong and the Yiddish Folksong project. Well, I have to tell you, it's the closest I ever got to having a heart attack. And I did it. And then I had the opportunity to do it again in Montreal. And that was recorded. And by some miracle, the Yiddish Book Center got hold, I don't know, I guess the materials must have been turned over to the Yiddish Book Center, and they got the recording. They digitized it, and I found it online. I listened to it. I couldn't believe my ears. This is like the early 70s. And so now we've got the Yiddish recording online, and Josh was good enough to provide an English translation. So I thank him very, very much.
Well, that's just another wonderful offshoot of your work, and it's nice to be there in the kind of genesis moment when you're saying these extremely astute things that are absolutely still relevant. It's kind of amazing to read this, to listen to that talk, because it kind of foreshadows a lot of what we're doing today. So it's time to turn to Janet Leuchtter, who will tell us what she did also long ago, which is now becoming available through the website. You're muted, Janet.
Thanks. Thank you, Mark. And thanks, Barbara. And I was very influenced by that Mariam Nierenberg record when it first came out, which I still have, an LP. And I'm having a little bit of an internet problem. Hopefully you'll be able to hear me. I can't always hear you.
Fine,
but
it's fine.
okay,
Yeah.
so far so good. Okay. I don't want to spend too much time talking about how I got to this, because I will just say that I did not grow up in a Yiddish speaking family, but I grew up in a community of with many Holocaust survivors. So I heard the sounds of, I won't say Yiddish so much, a little bit, but especially from the cantor of my childhood, who sang us some Yiddish songs that I still remember to this day. But especially in davening in the synagogue, where so I was able to really pick up the flavor of East European davening style. And sorry about that. And hold on, let me just. Okay, so forgot to turn off my phone. All right. I'm a singer primarily. I became a singer and then finally a cantor. I got very interested in Yiddish folk songs because I was interested in other folk songs, and finally I was very interested in Yiddish folk song as a representation of my own culture, because my ancestors are from Eastern Europe, also Central Europe. And so I got involved with in the earlier years of the klezmer revival, and had an all-women klezmer band, and taught at Klez Camp for the first couple of years in some other places, and did some recording. Then I tried to familiarize myself with as much repertoire as possible. And so fast forward, I became a cantor, and I went to cantorial school in my middle years, in middle age. So I am now in cantorial school at Hebrew Union College, which is the Reform Seminary, and this is in New York City, in their cantorial program. Okay, I'm very sorry. I cannot turn this off. Okay. Shoot. Okay. Being technologically challenged here. All right. I was in my last year, 1998, 1999, and we were required to do a master's project, which consisted of a written piece, like a thesis, and also a recital that was tied to that research. I decided to investigate Yiddish religious folk song because I had had an Israeli friend who at least 10 years before that had sung me a song from his father, who was a Hungarian chassid, that I had never heard before. I had never found it in any collections. The research that I did to try to understand where that song was coming from, and what other songs out there might be like it, or in that category of a Yiddish religious song, led me to do a survey of just about everything I could get my hands on, all of the written material, all of the collections in print, going back to Ginsberg Marek in 1902, which was just text, no music, as some of you know, and as much recorded music as possible, and also to try to get to hear archival recordings. And that was really tough because nothing was digitized at that time. You didn't have open archival field recordings that anybody could turn on their computer and listen to. So you had to get permission. You had to go from one place to the next. And fortunately, since I was a graduate student, I did get some permission. And in the summer of 1998, I spent a month in Miami because my parents lived nearby. And I was told about the University of Miami Music Library. And when I got to the library, I was told about the reel-to-reel tape or tapes there that had been recorded during the years of 1976 to 79 by two people. One was a professor of music literature named Elsie Fardig at the University of Miami, who unfortunately is no longer alive, and a Miami resident named Sherry Charna. These recordings were originally cassettes and later transferred to reel-to-reel. So I heard them reel-to-reel, and they document older Jewish residents of Miami Beach who regularly gathered for social events in Jewish community centers, synagogues, on the gazebo of the South Beach Boardwalk. I bet some of you may have heard them in those years. I did hear some of them sing to each other in those years. And I believe that is Joel Max on this call?
He was originally.
I think he was. And
Joel Sachs, I think.
Oh, it's Joel Sachs. I'm sorry. Yeah, I glanced at your name. Right. Okay. Hi. So now I think that I was thinking about Joel Max. Maybe it's you. It's Joel Sachs. So I may have gotten your name wrong. Joel, are you the documentarian of the University of Miami who did a lot of video of those people at that time and then later made a documentary called the Miami Beach Project? Is that you? Yes, it is. He put it into the chat. Great. So I didn't know that his video existed until just the other day when Itzik Gottesman told me. So I listened to these recordings that summer of 1998, and I realized that they were precious historical and musical documents. And the archivist there at the University of Miami Music Library made a number of transfers from those tapes to me, and from reels back to cassette. And I examined one song in particular that fits the category of a Yiddish religious folk song that I was studying. And of course, what a Yiddish religious folk song is, and how to define it and how to categorize this whole broad spectrum of songs is the subject of my master's thesis, which has just been posted on yiddishfolksong.com, mistakes and all, because of course, some of my research has been superseded, and I even listened to my transcription of this woman singing, and I realized I'd made a couple transcription mistakes, which you're going to see. So I am going to play. I don't want to get into a discussion of what Yiddish religious folk song is, but just to say that I'm defining it as either all Yiddish or in part Yiddish. So it could be Yiddish Hebrew, it could be Yiddish Hebrew Aramaic, something with Lashon Kodesh, holy text. It could also have a Slavic or a Hungarian text. In other words, the vernacular of the people that the Jews in that area were living among. And all these things have meanings, and which I'm not going to get into now, but is part of I attempt to unpack and get a view of in the master's thesis. And in that thesis, I looked at 3 songs after kind of giving a whole broad overview and summary. I talked about 3 songs in particular, and this is one of them. This is a song that reflects a pretty substantial category of Yiddish religious song. It has Hebrew text, Lashon Kodesh, holy language text, in this case Hebrew, as a chorus, and as a verse. The verse has verses, and the verses are in Yiddish. And that Yiddish verse, those Yiddish verses could either be a straight translation, they could be kind of a poetic translation with a little bit of commentary. It could really have a lot of commentary, or that Yiddish text could be so far afield of the meaning of the Hebrew or the Aramaic text, having absolutely on the surface nothing to do at all with that text. And I think that this is a really interesting cultural artifact, symbolizing a Jewish tradition of study of holy text and translation of it and interpretation of it and riffing on it. The songs in the East Ashkenazi folk song tradition that conform to this type of song can be serious, they can be humorous, they can be sarcastic, they can be angry, they can be bitter. So they have all kinds of, and textually, they have all kinds of emotional affect and meaning, right? And this one that I'm going to play is a very serious and very historically interesting song. It's the familiar Avinu Malkeinu, Our Father, Our King, which is one of the most well-known Hebrew liturgical prayers that are traditionally done on the high holidays, Jewish high holidays, and also on the 3 festivals. And they're done in the synagogue, and they're sung either davened or what have you, or sung together. So this is, you will hear a woman singing this, and then the Yiddish verses, which have a different melody. And I'm going to play Mrs. Faye from the Miami Beach Project singing. And I'm going to share the recording, and I'm going to share the text. And if I can find it, I'm going to share my transcription notation of the verse, just the Yiddish verse. Okay, so
we only have a couple minutes, Janet. So
okay, so I'm just going to play. I'll play you once. Let's see here. I won't play the whole thing. I'll just play. What happened? Oh, here it is. Yeah.
Avinu Malkeinu, Avinu Malkeinu, Choneinu v'aneinu, Kiyem bonu masi. Aseh Herr, mein Gebet, mein Gebet. Reboi noi Shalom, ich kann doch dein Welt nicht verstehen. Man hat umgebracht 6 Millionen Iden. Hoi Gott, sind nur in der letzten Krieg. Die Stannen sind noch nicht zufrieden. Sie schreien, sie noch nicht gehen. Hoi Avinu Malkeinu, Avinu Malkeinu, Avinu Malkeinu, Aneinu ve'aneinu, Kiyem bonu ma'asim. Aseyemu, Seidoka v'chesed. Aseyemu, Seidoka v'chesed, ve'hoishi einu.
I'm trying to stop it. Here, okay. Trying to stop the share. Sorry about that. So there are two other. Were you able to see the text at all as I was sharing it?
Yeah.
Yeah. So
it's fascinating.
yeah. So it starts off with the Yiddish verses. Start off with they murdered 6 million Jews. It wasn't enough for them. The second Yiddish verse says, what will be now, because we're not allowed to enter our homeland. For money, anything can be gotten, but not a homeland for the Jew. And where must we go now when we're so tired of running? And then the third verse seems to have been written later after the creation of the state of Israel, because she sings, we're not anymore the objects of shame and derision. We now have our land again, so let's all sing, be happy and sing the eternal song Avinu Malkeinu. So you could really just, I spent some time in the masters talking about the contrasting the meanings of the Yiddish versus the Hebrew text and what's really going on there, because there is a contrast. I know that we're at a time now. If anybody's more interested in getting the texts from me, I'm happy to send them the copy of the text and the recording. I don't think the recording is online right now, but I'll just finish by saying that two things. One is that one of the other songs that I researched heavily is on the Yiddish Song of the Week. Itzik Gottesman did a whole study of that particular song with the recording that I had gotten, plus some other recordings that he had and found. Tzedo Ladorech. So I encourage you to call Provision for the Journey. That was the song that started me off on this whole quest. It's all in Yiddish. The final thing I'll say is that anybody who's been in a synagogue, a non-Orthodox synagogue, for the last 30, 40 years knows that there's the contemporary Hebrew English type of religious song that is so prevalent now in America and North America, is a really contemporary version of this type of mixed language song, all of which are Yiddish. Okay. All of which are religious.
Now, this is fascinating, and the whole thing is up there now, and it's very apropos. I mean, we've started with just the lyrical Yiddish folk song in the Mariam Nierenberg and Leuchtter Widman kind of traditions, and we have been now expanding to the idea that there is Yiddish religious folk song, and so I'm going to turn to Hankus next, who is profiling, spotlighting a person who's mostly his repertoire was of the religious type. Hankus, are you there?
I am here.
Great, go for it.
Sorry, I got cut out. I'm at Dunkin' Donuts parking lot, which is my go-to when my internet goes out. Yay. Okay, so I am going to, this dovetails so beautifully with what Barbara and Janet have been talking about, because I'm going to be talking about someone named Morris Hollander. Morris Hollander is somebody who was born in a very small farming village in Carpatho-Ruthenia, Carpathian Mountains in 1925. I met him because he was the Baal Tefillah when I was shul shopping back in about 1990 in Waltham, Massachusetts. He read the Torah, he led the services, and I had this feeling that this guy was somebody who knew a lot, but had really not in any way documented his work. And I started doing that back then and did it for about 20 or 25 years. It was clear to me that this guy was a source of so many kinds of music. And that was, not only the religious music, which he was very, very adept at. Just to give you an example, I remember sitting at breakfast with him one day, and he was talking about doing the entire Yom Kippur service when he had been interred at Auschwitz. And somebody at the table said, "Wait a minute, how did you know it was Yom Kippur?" And he said, "Well, it didn't matter. They didn't feed us anything anyway, but I knew it all by heart. It was no problem." This guy, the sense of humor and the knowledge was unbelievable. And he turned out to be somebody who really was, well, I think Bertolt Brecht made this statement of someone calling himself someone who carried a brick around to show the world what his house was like. This was Morris Hollander. Anyone who stopped him could find out so much about everything in his life and in his culture. So he was educated in Cheder. There were 6 families in this farming village. And he talked a lot about the fact that he would then, at age 10, then he had to go to Beriksats, which was now called Berigovo, a city in Carpatho-Ruthenia, to go to Talmud Torah. Talked a lot about his Talmud Torah teacher. This is all on the website, thanks to Clara, by the way. It just went up today. So you can read a lot about Mr. Hollander. His Talmud Torah teacher, for example, while he was teaching them, he was very poor. So one of the things he would do is he would always be stomping raisins to make wine for Passover while he was teaching the children of the Talmud Torah. But Mr. Hollander learned everything that a young Jewish kid would learn. But he also had a very rich heritage because his family was harboring the Leuchtter Rebbe. So the Leuchtter Rebbe was a refugee from Poland who was fleeing the pogroms and all that. And he ended up in Carpatho-Ruthenia because Carpatho-Ruthenia was a paradise for Jews. And this mountainous area, this area of Czechoslovakia in general, before the war, was seen that way because of Thomas Masaryk, who was the president, who instead of riding around with the mayor in Munkac when he would visit, he would ride around with the chief rabbi, Rabbi Shapiro, the great Hasidic sage. And this Rabbi Shapiro had a cousin, and that cousin lived with the Hollanders. And the Leuchtter Rebbe, what Mr. Hollander remembers so much is not only the music, but he also remembers that Leuchtter Rebbe was an insomniac. So, for example, he slept in the same room as Mr. Hollander, and he would wake up every 15 minutes and start reciting Moida ani lefanecha, and then he'd fall back to sleep. But this is where he grew up. This is what he grew up with. His father remembered Nigunim. His father's side was Sephardic. Actually, they could trace their lineage back to Spain, but had lived in Eastern Europe for many, many generations. So they spoke lots of languages. The beautiful thing about the repertoire that Mr. Hollander brought is that he also brought stories of people. So it wasn't just about his repertoire. It was that this came from my Uncle Beryl, who had a long white beard, or this came from a certain, from my brother, who was a cantor, who was studying to be a cantor at the yeshiva in Leuchtter. And the Hollander family, in fact, was safe at the beginning of the 1940s because his uncle had served in the Prussian army in World War I. But in 1943, late in 1943, they were sent to Auschwitz. His father was murdered. His uncle was murdered. Two of his sisters were murdered. His brother died of malnutrition right after the war. It's a terrible story. However, Mr. Hollander talks about it as he almost died 5 times. He lived, so he went on and lived in Czechoslovakia till 1967 with his wife, and then came to Waltham, Massachusetts, and that's the story. So I want to just close by just playing some of these examples of the music, and I'm going to share them with you now, and then of course we'll have our traditional questions and answers. And so here we go. So what I want you to hear first is, so we have on the website an article by Max Wahlberg, which is fantastic, which links folk song with liturgical melodies. And that's very beautiful to look at. To me, what's really important about the whole world of folk song and liturgical melodies is the ethos, is the melos, is the feeling of it, is that if you just have the folk song in a book, you're not going to necessarily sing it anything like a Jewish song. But if you have this whole world together, you can put that together and hear a Jewish song. So let's hear a little bit to start. We're going to hear a nigun from Rabbi Shapiro from the Leuchtter Rebbe, sung by Mr. Hollander. Here we go. Oh, sorry. Oh my God. Okay, that somehow started in the wrong place. I'm terribly sorry. 1 second. I want to move that back. Yeah, there we go. Okay. I don't know how that happened, but I'll go to the beginning. Okay. God. Okay. Of a Hasidic nigun, and that's going to be very important if you're singing a folk song that's sad or that's pensive. On the other hand, if you're singing a folk song, here's a folk song about a Purim song, Achashverosh unser König. Now, first of all, because he lived in this little farming village, a lot of these things were very obscure. Only he knew them, and very few survivors kept them going. So here's a good example of a Purim song about Achashverosh.
Oy, Achashverosh unser König, lumai mai, hat doch sechel sehr wenig, lumai mai, essen kenner a viele Schüssel, lumai mai, oder lernen kennen nur a bissel, lumai mai. Oy,
Achashverosh is not very smart. He doesn't have much seichel. And there we go. And this is what the Cheder kids were singing. But here's an example of Mr. Hollander's cousin, Marty, because of course the women all sang in these Orthodox families back then, and they would get together, and she actually made up this song also about Purim. So I don't want you to hear her, and she's still alive in LA and still shares these songs with Mark David on the Yiddish Voice. So this is, I was born during Purim, and it's
Ich bin geboren, Simchas Pieren, Freiler bin ich der Pfarr. Ich esse, trinke, tanze, spring, und traurig sein sogar. Ich kann sein a Schnei, ich tanze, schrei Hurra. Tommer her, ich Musik spielen, mit sich tanzen gleich. Tommer her, ich Musik spielen, kick ich auf kein Sach. Kaum hab ich nur Musik daher, kick ich auf kein Sach. Es geht mir a rüber, a Gerohl in meinen Körper, meine Nerven werden zerglitt. Ach, krieg de Hitze, tanzen, schwitz, und her wie Musik spielen. Ram, tarararararara, tararara, tarararararara, tarara, tararara, tarararararara.
She could not help dancing. There's a story, the next verse, there's a guy getting shaved by the barber, and he starts dancing in the chair, and he gets cuts all over his face, but he can't stop dancing. Et cetera, et cetera. Anyhow, this is the kind of folk song the kids were making up in the Carpathian Mountains in the late 1930s. And because of Mr. Hollander, we know what they are. And I think I'll conclude with that. I just think it's so wonderful to have Mr. Hollander's material on this website because it brings together the entire world of one person's musical life, which can be an entire world.
Great, great. Thank you so much, Hankins, for enriching the offerings. And this is, the more we open up the treasure house of the Yiddish folk song, the more gems and jewels and different kinds of, we find there. And so we hope to keep filling this out with people who have these kinds of unique materials and can talk about them, at the level at which we're doing this now. So we do have a little bit of time. If I don't know if there are any questions out there, and if not, that's fine too. But if anybody wants to has a specific question about this, we could handle that for a few minutes here. I should say that the next project that we've agreed upon in the team is to do a set of dialogues with people, like Haggis, like Janet, like Barbara, who are really into the depths of this material, and have them dialogue with us on specific topics about analyzing the song, so that we will move further into the analysis as well as the presentation, which should be going hand in hand. And I'll say I really appreciate the point you made, Hank, is that there are two kinds of aspects to your point. One is that without live performance in the sense of the aesthetic and we don't really understand or can't really get inside the Yiddish folk songs, the point that Ethel Rehm makes all the time in our discussions, and Michael Alpert and so on. The other is that my point, which is that there is an aesthetic behind all this, an aesthetic of sound, an aesthetic of voice production, as well as an aesthetic of pacing and presentation and pronunciation, but also of melody and how melody unfolds, which goes across all these so-called genres of Yiddish music, cantorial, liturgical, everyday song, folk song, klezmer as well. These are all too often seen as being separate domains, and which one influenced the other, which to me is an absolutely pointless discussion, because I think there's this deep aesthetic behind which Isai Zamsovsky calls ethno-hearing, or the other kind of Russian term intonatsia for this general sensibility. And so I think while we're focusing on the Yiddish folk song, we have to constantly, make as sharp a definition as we can to keep from spilling over into other areas of research, and because we can't do everything. But by focusing on the song, we are also, I hope, shedding light on the more general aesthetic and the more general range of expression. This is cultural expression of the East European Jews, who, as Zev Feldman points out repeatedly, are really distinctive among all the Jewish peoples in having such a wealth of, non-liturgical materials that they produce. And so we're unpacking that. So since I don't see a whole wealth of questions and we're running really
I
well,
see Sam Weiss raised his hand a while ago. It's on the screen.
well, yeah, it should be in the chat, but
Okay.
if somebody wants to jump in, that's fine. We only have kind of general comments so far.
I wanted to say that this
Yeah.
tradition is alive and well in various communities that have Hasidic
Absolutely,
Jewish
absolutely,
populations, Lakewood, Williamsburg, Borough Park, Muncie,
of course.
etc. So it would be very worthwhile to do some research in those communities. And
There's more being done, and there are more bridges being built because the supposedly unbridgeable chasm between the secular and the Hasidic Jews seems to be just blurring nowadays. There are people from that community dialoguing with people in the mainstream Jewish community about music, and yeah, that will probably find its way in some form eventually in our work. And I'm really pleased to see that kind of interactivity growing, instead of a kind of an isolation and distrust on both sides. Yeah, it's a good point. Okay, everybody, it looks like we have done what we set out to do, which is plant the milestone along the path of understanding the Yiddish song.
Mark,
tune in.
Isabel Frey has her hand up too.
Oh, okay. Isabel, do you want to say something? Yeah.
Yeah, sorry. Yeah, I had a question actually still for Barbara about what you said about the chasm that was there between the generations of folklorists in Eastern Europe and then in the US. And I was wondering, like, how do you, I mean, does this gap kind of also explain the lack of scholarship, or I don't really know how to interpret this break.
Sure. Well, Isabel, thank you very much for asking. You have to think 60s. The 60s is really not that long after the Holocaust. If you think of survivors arriving in the 50s, 68 is the exodus, from Poland after the March 68 campaign. It's a very different period from 2021. So you have to try to imagine that. And YIVO was really, they were, if not all survivors, they had come in the 20s and 30s, just before the war, because YIVO had an American branch, the Mocktail of YIVO in New York. And what had happened in Poland in this very short period between 1925 and 39, it's only 14 years. 14 years is like nothing. And in the 14 years, YIVO had established as one of its most important departments, a department of folklore and ethnography. And in the 30s, they, particularly the late 30s, they established the Aspirantur program, which was an attempt to provide academic graduate level training to young scholars, including folklorists and people who would study the Yiddish folk song. And this is like, Pippa, and of course the granddaddy of them all was Yud Lamed Khan. So I think that the period in which YIVO was working, YIVO was full of hope, hope for the future. The institution, garnered enormous enthusiasm from the Jewish masses. They had this Sammler ethos where everybody could be a collector, and that if you were to collect and send what you collected to YIVO, you were helping to build an edifice, a kind of university for a people without a state. So there was enormous energy. So you can imagine that when that whole group of these aspirantur, of these young scholars that YIVO was training in folklore, ethnography, folk song, that when they perished in the Holocaust, and you have an attempt to relocate YIVO in New York, in 1939, 1940. And, the New York headquarters is now, really a shadow, a shell of what there was in Evo. And the collections are still in Europe. God only knows where they are. Will they ever be retrieved? So in the years that followed, the 50s, basically, I would say the 50s and the 60s, that is, anybody working in the field didn't have a PhD. Bina Weinreich, I think, had an MA. I don't think it actually mattered because I think she did fabulous work. But in terms of building a field in the American context, the linguists, Uriel Weinreich, Michael Herzog, yes. But, Hanem Lotek, no. Bina Weinreich, no. They did fabulous work. And actually, people with PhDs don't even hold a candle to them. That isn't the point. But the point is that they're, coming before me was essentially this other generation. And I represented a new generation born and raised here of parents from Eastern Europe. My parents were born and raised in Poland, who was being actually academically trained with a PhD in folklore. This is a big deal. It would have been unheard of. I mean, these young Jewish scholars, it wouldn't have happened in Poland or in Eastern Europe. So somehow they placed an enormous amount of hope. They really, it was a huge responsibility, and it was daunting, for somebody in their 20s, and my Yiddish and their Yiddish. I'll tell you one short story, and then I'll stop because I know that we have to close. And this is so Yivo, but I'll never forget it as long as I live. After I gave the speech in Yiddish at the Waldorf Astoria by Gedeckte Tischen, and was as nervous, I mean, beyond nervous, I can't even describe how, heart attack it was. I come to Yivo the next day, that was on a Sunday. I come to Yivo on a Monday, and my little postkastel, and my little sort of pigeonhole for my mail, there's an index card. The index card is unsigned, anonymous, with a list of my grammatical mistakes. Well, I have to tell you, it was devastating. I mean, I prepared so meticulously, and I had to deliver this thing orally in front of all of these people who were deeply invested and extremely knowledgeable. And that's what I got back. I mean, it wasn't the only thing I got back, but I just thought, I mean, I don't know what the future is going to look like if this is how you treat me. But
well, yeah,
event,
I agree. I was subject to a little of that. They could be merciless with us at the same time that they were nurturing us.
Exactly.
Barbara brought me into Yivo, and so I'm the next generation at some level. And my degree was not in Yiddish matters, but I immediately saw that there was a whole generation of people like me coming into this, and that these new graduate students were coming in who have now become major figures, and that it was a moment. It was a zeitgeist moment where we all felt like there was something happening.
Yes,
so maybe one more thing, because I know Joe Sachs wanted to say something. Joe, if he's still there.
Yeah. I just wanted to thank the organizers of this. This is incredible. I've been out of the loop in terms of doing the folk song collection, and I've just recently begun to try to figure out a way to put the archive that I've collected using video primarily in Miami Beach from the mid 80s to the 90s. I also did the Freiheit Gesangsverein, what was left of it, the Jewish People's Philharmonic Chorus, on 3/4 inch in the 80s, and other parts of the Linke, the Freiheit. I spent time with Mr. Novik and other staffers there. So I have work to do. I just want to thank this whole event, and there's so much knowledge on the screen that I would urge the organizers, maybe, I know it's worked, but with Zoom now we have this new profound technology. The revolution will be Zoomed, if you know Gil Scott-Heron's song. And so the Yiddish revolution here, a revival, every month to mine the wisdom on the screen. I would love to hear from so many people here of what their experiences, what they want to share. So I just want to urge that. I think we could all come and share things, and every month have a gathering. I put in the chat, I would love to have a breakout room to just hear people's responses to what they've had today, experienced today. I know we don't have time for that. Thank you.
Okay, and we do hope you will make your materials available, digitized, and so that we can have the benefit, like in these other archival moments of the great work that you did. Well, thank you all. Shalom Aleichem, everybody, and onward we go. And yes, we hope for more discussions and more meetings to carry on the work. So that's it for now from here, and thanks everyone for coming. Bye-bye.